Okay, hello. Um, Hello to everyone who has joined us on this evening to celebrate and commemorate Senzeni Marasela as she will be presenting shortly in during Photo London with her series Theodora Comes to Joburg. I'd like to begin by thanking Solange and the entire Photo London team for bringing us together. Of course, I'd like to thank Senzeni Marasela for creating this occasion for me to be able to really kind of get into things and have a great conversation. I am Ayana V Jackson. I am a visual artist from the United States, but based in Johannesburg and New York, and alternately in Paris and Mexico City. I have had the opportunity to work with Senzeni as an artist in residence at the Still Artist Residency, a program that supports artists in Johannesburg. But more importantly, I've known Senzeni for many, many years as a valued part of the South Africa fine art community, and even more specifically as part of the photographic community. I think it's amazing that we're going to have a chance to, as we've been watching Senzeni's practice evolve into other media, I think it's just amazing that we're going to have this opportunity to return to where it all began with Theodora Comes to Joburg. I'm just going to briefly read a little bit of her bio before we get into it. Senzeni Marasela was born in 1977 in Thokoza. She lives and works in Soweto, South Africa. Senzeni Marasela is a cross-disciplinary artist who explores photography, video, prints, and mixed medium installations involving textiles and embroidery. Her work deals with the history, memory, and personal narrative, emphasizes historical gaps. Excuse me. I'm so sorry, I'm a little sick. Excuse me. I apologize for that. Um, and she graduated from the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. Since any, while I gather myself, if I can ask the first question, which is to let us know a little bit more about the impetus for Theodora Comes to Joburg. And forgive me, I unfortunately came down with a bug.
Uh, um, Good evening. I think it's 7 o'clock in Johannesburg, where I am at the moment in my studio. Um, when I came to Johannesburg, because I come from the East Rand, 45 minutes outside of Johannesburg. For me, the city center, Johannesburg, I'd gone through it as a child with my father when we'd go to buy clothes, the Stutterfords, go to Pretoria. So I've always imagined the city as a very transitory space, a space that you go through. No one really lives there. It's a space of a transition. There's always changes happening in Joburg. That when I left the East Rand and came to study at the university, this is 1995, February. It was a massive shock for me, because other than passing through by train as a child with my father, I'd never been to Johannesburg, really, and walked those streets and understood what was happening there. Um, and also, I became a student in 95, a year after Mandela becomes the president of South Africa. You know, it, I became a student when we were discovering a whole lot of archives, histories that we weren't aware of before. And then I go back to my childhood when I was a student and remember that, the photograph, we take so many of them now with cell phones. Everyone is a photographer now, I guess, with all the apps that are coming up. How dangerous having a particular photograph was when I was a child. We didn't know, what Mandela looked like, and I think for the longest time possible, we thought his name was Free Mandela because every time we heard about him, it was concerts at the Wembley, yeah, concerts all over the world, advocating for the freedom of Mandela. So that becomes a permanent part of my childhood. And how my own father, who loved books, who collected books, sometimes very dangerous books, they would use us as children and to take books from one house to the next, and they would wrap them in newspapers and brown paper. That the machinery of apartheid was so terrifying that people were terrified even in their own houses, of being caught having the wrong image or having an image that might land them in jail. So I go to university 95 until 98, and I go through, I guess, going through archives and everything that was revealed, and the whole shock of discovering the other side of South African history and discovering Sarah Baartman and how archives are kept, and all these photographs that we had no chance of seeing as children, up until 95, up until I'm in university. So when I'm now a student, I think then when I was in third year, I decided what my mission was going to be as an artist, to seek these archives, to document the stories, to claim some of them as my own, and to find ways of inserting my own mother and my aunts in that narrative. You know, so I mean, my mother, who is schizophrenic, she's now near 80 and has dementia, has very traumatic memories of Johannesburg because she arrives in Johannesburg in the 60s. She remembers sites of trauma. She remembered where things happened. She remembers the first time that she saw someone get shot. But this is now 1960s Joburg. So when I did Theodora Comes to Joburg, which is what Koop Projects is going to present at Photo London, is really trying to retrace my mother's footsteps in 2004 Johannesburg. Go and look for traces of what my mother remembers of Joburg. And quite conscious, and I think even then I decided that I would perform a lot of my work. So I was performing at the time in the yellow dress, which my mother had given me the dress. Walked around Joburg and and documented spaces that my mother had experienced trauma and some tragedy in them. A lot of the things that I'd been thinking of pursuing, because I was a lot younger in 2002 and not sure of my processes then. After I spoke to her and I came back to Johannesburg, then I started this project where I went to very specific places because the strange thing is that my mother remembered the streets quite well, the names of the streets. So I went to these places with a notebook, and try and stand in the same spots, the way that she remembered those places, and wearing her dress, and things that I'd borrowed from her, as I made my journey throughout Joburg. Because I went all the way to Soweto, because she had lived in Soweto up until um the mid-70s. I live in Soweto now, in the middle of Soweto, um which I do by choice large. And I guess living in Soweto has shaped a lot of what I do. you know a lot of the oral stories that I've collected about Johannesburg, about people who have like very clear memories of 60s, 70s, and early 80s Joburg. um
And as you, just as if you don't mind, I wanted to uh, kind of go back to talking about the history of photography and the disruption of the archive due to the apartheid system. And what it reminds me of as a US American is the first time, well, of course, it reminds me of House of Bondage and Ernest Cole and Flatterly and Thomas Flatterly. For some who may not know, there because photography was essentially or documentation of the atrocities or the realities essentially of the apartheid state was not allowed to be brought out into the world. It was really people who risked their lives, photographers, many
Yeah.
photographers who risked their lives to smuggle their rolls of film. And so many, a large way that a lot of the world got a chance to understand what was going on was largely due to South African photographers who were able to relay with Americans or people that were actually escaping or going into exile, and were able to get them published on the other side. And so it is we've talked in the past about the importance of photographs as an historical object, and when you are in a landscape where for a generation or more that was disrupted, then you have this urgency that it seems you felt to recreate the archive and to step into it. I just wanted to ask you, um, you first engaged with your mother's dress, and then you moved, right, into another space. What was the significance for you? I'm thinking about when in photography we talk about self-portraiture, and then where does self-portraiture end and performance begin, and where does performance of archives that interest or either interest or reflect you become self-portraiture again. I'm curious about um, how the where what it means for you to step into this character, and where is the space between portraiture and self-portraiture and performance, and how do you consider that?
You know, when I was going through family albums, because I had family members that were very politically active in the 80s, um, who the only photographs would have were newspaper photographs, some of them, because the police were pursuing them. You know, uh, I think we also, as South Africans, understood the absence of the photograph and the absence of the archive when Mandela came out. When people were now starting to tell stories. And I can understand why a lot of us in South Africa, or probably in the continent already, who handle images and look at photography and look at the photograph as a document, start looking at our own stories, because those are missing in our archives. We have these years of erasure, very systematic erasure. I remember years ago, I was working with an American researcher, looking at music and how a lot of the music would have scratches in between. If the government thought there was something that was overtly political or sexual, they would scratch out those words and leave the other. So you have all these interruptions through music, through culture. There's a story of Johnny Clegg when he was alive. He told his story very well about how he used to hide so that he can go and perform with musicians in the hostels. So, I think for the South African, the photographer, the artist who handles ideas of autobiography in issues of personal histories, it's about the attempt to retell stories that couldn't be told. There was no opportunity to. certain stories landed you in jail. There were people who died for photographs in South Africa for many years, you know, and the implications of possessing particular photographs. So I guess then for me, starting out, I think it was probably the first major body of work that I did after I graduated was this Theodora Comes to Joburg. Where for me, I think even then, it was not just about my mother, it was about other women as well, you know, of my mother's circumstances, who came to Joburg, were traumatized by it, ended up occupying peripheries or not coming to Joburg at all. You know, my aunts left Joburg in the 80s and went back to villages in the Eastern Cape because they thought, gosh, life is very difficult here as a Black woman. It's difficult to access space. It is difficult to try and formulate one's identity in a space because cities are very masculine and intimidating and very threatening. You know, they are space that men largely view as very territorial, and they occupy them with a lot of aggression. You know, so I guess my project is a way of using women like my mother, my aunts, to try and find ways of entering the city and finding ways of being in the city.
That's that's really interesting to think about because you know in the work and in subsequent work, I think you move through or the character Theodora
Mm.
moves through multiple landscapes, and but when I first came to South Africa, I found I really enjoyed town because I like the pedestrianness of it. But at the same time, when you say that it's very masculine and it's very threatening, it's true because everyone is, for good reason, reminding you of your safety because of the not overpopulation, because of the dense population. Um, and the thing is, people talk about people who went crazy, people from the cities, and thinking about as people were beginning to migrate from in the United States context, because we're as two photographers, but we are also two different. We also both work with archive, but we're also dealing with similar. The United States and South Africa have a weird intertwining. Like sometimes it meets up and then it goes far, and then so I can't help but to relate it to narratives that I'm aware of from the United States. But I remember hearing that during the Great Migration of the gold rush and all of this from the east into the west of the United States, there were people who were used to being in densely populated areas, and then they would go to places where you hear nothing but birds, and the silence, is can be deafening, right? So the idea that you go from busy, vibrant to like nothingness or to just nature to build a city, what is the psychological transition you have to go through? So likewise, the women that you're referencing in your work, are there's so many sensory changes that they had to get used to by now entering this um, this very dense and masculine and threatening environment. I wanted to ask you um, about the the um, the what would you say are other narratives that are, because I know that in the newer work you move into topography and mapping, but it begins with, as you said, your mother, because of if I understood you correctly, aspects related to her mental state, had really felt traumas, sites of trauma and sites of her memory, it sounds as you were speaking earlier, as if her memory really held, and her body held things that we forget, that
Mhm.
um, not everyone experiences sights, landscapes exactly the same. So as you were choosing your locations, what was your experience, and how did you choose the locations? For instance, it looks like we're in town in the image on the screen.
Mhm. Here we're not far. She led me to the site, and I was quite pleasantly surprised when I found it. It used to be the old Joburg electricity supply, called the Electric Workshop. And in the 90s, it became a space of celebration. There were a lot of raves that went in here, concerts. It's gone through a lot of transition, this space. There were times when the Turban Art Fair was held here, and now there are government offices at the moment. Um, she remembers this space, particularly in 1966, when she first arrived in Joburg, and how she would walk down here. Because I wouldn't have found this place if it wasn't
Mm,
from her memories of leading me here, and how you walk in, which door that you use, and how it was such a quick space to hide. Because then you had to be in the city until 6 o'clock. And if you were late, you had to hide, otherwise you'd go to jail for in whatever amount of time that you'd be sentenced to. And it's not even far from a very notorious police station in Joburg, then called John Foster Square. Um, so I think for me, I spent a lot of time in this building. I was quite interested in how it has gone through being a place of hiding, a place of terror, to becoming a place for music, concerts, a place of post-Mandela South Africa, to being a place occupied by artists, through the Turban Art Fair that was here for a couple of years, and to now being a seat of the provincial government, the last time I saw this building. That now there's almost no traces. I marvel at how time erases traces of trauma. I think the same way you find that in gentrification of cities, that
mm,
every time a city and a space goes through gentrification, there's also an erasure of certain stories in those spaces.
mm,
Um, that people that now occupy those spaces, don't want to tell those stories or not to deal with them, and also people that are so affected by those stories. I mean, this space had a huge impact on how I look at my work and the idea of the photograph, and also kind of working from my mother's words, to what she remembered. Because I mean, this was 2004 when I did this work, and relying on 1966, 67 memories of the space, um, and what it was when I walked in before new transitions happened.
mm,
And of course, one discovers a whole lot of other spaces, like this.
mhm,
And also other stories that one picked up, whether it was through the TRC that happened after Mandela became president for a couple of years. But then, having been actively in the city since 95 until now, there's so much changes that have happened. I think it's also the same when every time I go to New York, I almost marvel at how the streets that I marked when I go back there, they're not the same anymore. There's something else that comes up. There's another building, there's something else getting refurbished. The dynamics of the streets change. Um, you know,
As you pause, I just want to as you pause, I just want to remind our audience that if you'd like to ask a question, please feel free to go to the Q&A section on your screen and leave questions. Please continue.
yes, you know, and you know, I think my career. So now we start with 2002. I'm in Amsterdam with Dolly Ratebe. We are talking about African Jim. Jim Comes to Joburg. I mean, it's a movie that happened way back, and Dolly Ratebe was one of the actors there. And Jim comes to Joburg, but he gets mugged and he becomes disillusioned. But he joins a band and he wants to correct the city, and I guess this hope of bringing something very rural into the city. There's been so many attempts to fix the city, you know,
Mm.
in various ways, whether it's lobby groups, it's people like Jim who wants to get rid of crime in the city, who goes in and out of nostalgia, for the village, where he comes from, because I think after then, these images, a lot of my work dealt with this idea of nostalgia,
Mm.
this longing for what is very familiar or similar, because Joburg changes very rapidly. It's the nature of cities. The transition is very aggressive, very rapid, and probably very impersonal as well.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's not like the villages, that my mother would have come from and my aunts, where things pretty much stay the same. Um,
Hmm. Can I, well, I'm going to ask, we have a question in the room, but I will first, as a tangent to it, I'd love for you to tell us more about the dress itself. Um, what, what do we know about that style of dress, that your mother wore and that you reference? And the first question we have says, thank you both so much for a fascinating and engaging conversation.
mhm.
How does your photography practice intertwine with other mediums such as textile in the works that you make?
Uh, mm, you know, a lot of my work starts with a photograph. I spend a lot of time going through archives. I still do to this day. For me, whether it's photographs that I have taken myself or photographs that I found in archives, the photograph becomes very important in my work. You know, um, it's important, as I said very early on, for the reason that it's missing in my childhood, it's missing in South African history. It's also missing in the context of Black women. A lot of Black women that I knew and spoke to years back didn't have photographs. They were afraid of taking them. So the fear of having those photographs was a way in which people um, kind of silence themselves,
Mm-hmm.
made sure that they were not visible, and understood the threat that the photograph imposed. So the work that I do on fabric starts with a photograph most of the time. It starts with a lot of it me photographing myself, and using that as a starting point for creating works on fabric. And also my interest in fabric, has to do with also with colonial history, which is entirely about omission, erasure, and trying to use those fabrics, to kind of tell a different story. Um, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I always start with a photograph. I think to this day, I probably have taken close to 10,000 photographs. I have cameras. I continue to take photographs. I look at them, get them. I get led to archives all the time.
Mm. Hugh Rees says, your use of colors in the photograph of your mother in the yellow dress is very striking. Would you comment on your use of colors?
I think at this time, when I did the work, my mother gave me a couple of dresses, and she had the most memories around this particular dress because she had had this dress for years. She had remembered how she went back to Joburg wearing this dress after she had not been in years. I think my mother probably has not been to Johannesburg for the last 30 years. She refused to go back to Joburg. For any reason possible. She just would not go back. She very reluctantly attended my graduation at Wits in 1999 when I finished my undergrad, in great protest. Because for her, Joburg is a site of immense trauma. So she gave me this dress. And she remembers the last time that she wore it, that she went to Joburg with my father. And she never went back to Joburg after that. She still hasn't been to this day. Um, she's near 80 now, and she's never returned to the city. And I took on this dress, with an understanding that women like my mother and my aunts, who are still alive, most of them in their 80s, some in the 90s, who never went back to Joburg, never went back to the city, after they left, whatever they were doing. And then when you do speak about them, it's all when you do speak to them, it's all the stories again of trauma, isolation, of witnessing violence, years of violence, of systematic oppression. So Joburg for them is a site of trauma, where for me, it's a site or a place um, of looking for stories, of looking for ways in which one can claim her own South Africanness as a Black woman, can claim space, can insert her identity into the space.
Absolutely. I believe we do have another slide. Another slide that we can present. Um, um, and so I wanted us to talk about the location that we're in. I believe I know where we are. But if you can tell us
Yeah.
about the site that we're at now.
Um, you know, my father, who was a policeman the bulk of his life, was at this place on June the 16th, 1976. A couple of streets down. Um,
Hector
you know,
Peterson.
and
Memorial.
yes, and my mother here lived in Dlamini, which was on the other side of Soweto. They lived there. And again, my going back to Hector Peterson has to do with with dealing with memories from the 70s, dealing with archives, with stories, and when I went there, because before we took this image, I'd been there several times, and I'd seen how people, South Africans don't come visit this place. But I've seen how people who are not South African, the first way that you mark them is how they kind of sit in complete shock at this space. And I've seen people sit for, especially in this area, go and sit there for quite a long time. To try and take in. A lot of children died around this area on June the 16th. And I think Hector Peterson died near here as well, whose image again became world famous. Um, you, you, I think I think to this day I struggle to kind of process what went on in this space. I go back there as an activist and to do some community work. But there's always this thing lingering around the spaces of trauma in South Africa. You're always there and also searching for something, as if someone needs to come and tell you a different story. Because I think the sheer trauma and the violence of these spaces, and to think that there are people who are still alive, who have memories of these places, and we're walking in them, and they're now monuments, and we have to deal with them in a different way, and also deal with the enormity of this history that is at once erased and also partly available and um, reimagined in some way. And there are a lot of images that I shot in the space.
As I look at it, it reminds me of there was an exhibition that we both participated in called The Demonstration, curated by Siwa Mgoboza. And I remember that during that, the programming that was put together for that exhibition, you very generously led a walking tour. I don't know that I don't remember, I don't believe we went to the museum. I think you
No, we didn't.
chose you chose the Regina Mundi, and you
Yeah.
chose was it White City, and places that are not always um, engaged with. And it is interesting to have had the the privilege to experience that with you, and um, because it also must be, I wonder what it must be like to, I mean, buses and busloads of people come to visit these spaces, almost like not even like a pilgrimage, which might make a little bit more sense because you're walking in the trail of people's blood, more often
Mm-hmm.
than a site of celebration of culture, which we tend to, when I'm sitting here in Venice and everyone's visiting, the churches and the monuments and these kind of spaces of celebration of culture. And of course, we do have museums with different objectives and agendas, but typically when one comes to Soweto, you're visiting sites of trauma, in a place where people live and continue to experience trauma. So, and the reality that your mother doesn't return, and so many people didn't return, is also interesting, because it's almost as if, yeah, I don't, as you said, there was I don't know, there's also the possibility. I know, and I come up in a family that experienced the civil rights movement, and my stepmother is from Watts, California, and she's got no interest in visiting South Central LA, especially in the 80s and the 90s after she had left. But at the same time, there's this gentrifying, and now everyone wants to visit these new suburbs. And for her, I think that there's a kind of like it there's a I don't know if it's cognitive dissonance is the word that I want to use, but you know, um, it's hard to experience it new, even as something that's supposedly positive and rejuvenated, with because it still sits on the land of something that's deeply painful, and embedded in the psyche. And there's also there was I should look if I can find the scholar. I will, that wrote a book about what it means to return to these spaces, and the site is no longer there. So to go to your grandmother's house where your great grandmother died and where you were raised, and now it's a nail salon or a boutique wine shop. Even if there was a moment when you didn't necessarily want to hang out or feel safe in front of that, on that porch at a certain time in history. The reality that now there's a whole new society of people who have no recollection engaging with that
Mm.
space can be incredibly traumatic. I just want to remind our audience that if you'd like to ask a question, please feel free.
When and I'm thinking to, since I made a decision to go live in Soweto, I've taken so many people on trips to Soweto and consciously avoid spaces that I'd photograph this body of work in. I don't think I've ever taken anyone there. To your Hector Peterson memorials, to Isaac Morrison, to Naledi High School. I've always, I think for me, who is probably the second, well, the next descendant of people who experience this, to knowing people who, when they try and retell the stories of Soweto, start crying, and these are grown people, who tell you how when they got off the wrong stop, how they were beaten up and ended up in jail for 6 months. And then because Soweto is so big and vast, and there are other stories in Soweto. That for me, I've always chosen the middle of Soweto, because I think Soweto tourism is so focused on June the 16th and Vilakazi Street, where Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu once lived as neighbors, even though for a very brief period. But a lot of the tourism that happens in Soweto, yes, you are correct. You're basically walking in places where there was a lot of blood, where a lot of people died. And I also understand why a lot of much older people don't want to go back there. They don't want to go see the June the 16th because they lived there. They remember watching that, as children, as a lot of them. And to go and relive that moment where now it's becoming a tourist site. People go there to take photographs, and there isn't a lot of traces of what happened in the past. Um, my Theodora is kind of then preoccupied with those spaces, and returning to those spaces in character. Because as Senzeni, I wouldn't. There's no way I'd go back to the June 16 memorial at any time. I don't.
Mm.
It's the same thing with the Apartheid Museum. That is, I took tourists there once. After they'd come for a conference, I stood outside and I said to them, "Well, you'll find me here in the bench. I'm not going in. I don't want to deal with that history. I don't want to look at it. I don't want to be reminded of the residues of that history. I've seen it. I don't want to see it again and again, you know. It's terribly painful, the Apartheid Museum. Um, and also how it's set up, very triggering, for someone who
Yes.
remembers child violence
Mm.
in the late 80s, in the early 90s. So I think for my take on Soweto is that there's always, and people have tried to find some semblance of joy in Soweto. I think the other photographs that are going to be shown, the 2007 series after these ones, they speak about this, things that people did as a way of escaping this trauma that they lived around and they lived with. Imaginary things, and I remember as a child, we had A2 Cinema, which is now a shopping center, where we used to go and watch all these Western movies. And then I remember the photograph changed with the coming of movies in Soweto. That when people pose, they'd be climbing on top of trees, doing all these reenactments of the Chinese and Japanese character stars. So you have a whole generation of very animated photographs, and some of that also trickles to weddings. you know, and the photographs where people would pose in a particular way and dress up as a form of escape from the daily reality that we had to live with in the 80s. You know, so the photograph in the 80s becomes whichever photograph was taken that wouldn't land you in jail, you know, was a document of escape. You use a photograph to escape that reality. It became an object of fantasy. They were a form of escape, you know, from, I guess, the systematic violence that one lives with as a Black woman. The kind of aggressions, whether they were very micro and very overt when I was dressed as Theodora, particularly when I was traveling. I traveled a lot
Mm-hmm.
when I was wearing that. You know, spent 4 hours at JFK Airport answering question after question after question about my dresses, why I do, you know, even though I took out my passport, you know, to being offered food on the subways. Eventually, when I got in, and people offering to pay for my coffee and bagels because I was staying not far from Columbia. To being offered money and clothes. And then I realized that in that red dress, I carried the look of poverty. You know, that people don't expect women like me or women like Theodora in particular spaces. So that work was a form of escape, I guess. And went back to childhood again, you know, back to those photographs that my mother used to force us to take with exotic backgrounds. Because I think taking photographs in the reality that we lived in would not have been ideal.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we had those moments of escaping 1980 South Africa, you know, through those photographs.
Yeah.
You know, even though my uncles and aunts don't want to see those photographs, because every time when I take them out, they're like, no, 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 put those things away. They're no longer so
Yeah.
fashionable. You know, but I think it was also the wish for something so distant. That's how traumatic apartheid was. You know, that the mind often traveled to distant places, you know, and wishes that you were not here. You could be elsewhere. You could escape this reality. You could make up one, find one, you know, where at least there could be some rest, some joy, because yeah, a lot of people in South Africa, Black people that is, it wasn't even safe in your own bedroom because, you know, the police would come and raid people's houses and knock down doors and break windows. You know, that the idea of sanctuary and the idea of safety was heavily compromised. You know, I think still a whole lot of them. You know, I remember when my father was still alive, and he said to me, you know, you're probably not safe anywhere in the world, or even in your head, you're not safe in your imagination as a Black woman. That there is no
Right.
security for you anywhere. You know,
Mm-hmm.
that one might as well do whatever they need to or whatever they want to be happy, to be whole, you know, because you don't have that opportunity to feel safe and be safe, you know, and imagine what the sense of security is for a Black woman in the world.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, you know, as women, as Black women, we do our best to create it for each other.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, um, the vulnerability is just it's immense. But it's also it's you know yeah I'm thinking about it because as I believe you're while embracing that reality and that being the reality, you're sitting in town, you chose a studio in the central business
Mm,
district and in Bloemfontein, which is right next to Jeppy's Town, which has been
mm,
supposedly rebranded Maboneng. You live and work in Soweto. You continue to engage with the city. So also there's this defiance, but we have to remember that even in that defiance, there's a vulnerability. Um,
Mm.
so I commend you for that work. And, the thing that I think we all have to remember is that, the risk that you take to yourself and your own psyche as Senzeni Marasela to potentially to risk the traumatizing of yourself by going into these stories is has to be noticed. And I really want to applaud you for taking that on, because I think that there's so much, again, as you mentioned, space and gentrification and sites of trauma and remembrance and erasure, the work of getting that done to remind us that this happened and that it is happening, and that as we move in our humanity over time, that we need to know how not to do this, as a perpetual aspect of human relationships. And so I just want to commend you for the work that you're doing. And is there anything else that you'd like to mention before we close out?
No, I think I'm also, I am on social media. I'm open to questions and engagement there, about my work and about my processes and my stories and my interest in the photograph and in the archive. I think there's also possibilities of it continuing there.
Absolutely. And so, what Senzeni Marasela will be presenting during Photo London from the 15th to the 19th of May with Koop Projects in Discovery. You can find her via Instagram at, please remind me, your Instagram is just at Senzeni
It's
Marasela,
Senzeni
or
Marasela. Yes. Senzeni, just my
at
name, Senzeni Marasela.
Senzeni Marasela. I'm putting it um,
Mm.
in the chat. And yes, so hopefully at Senzeni Marasela on Instagram. Any other,
Yes.
and the website is also in the chat,
Yes,
www.marasela.com.
marasela.com.
Um, and yes, once again, I am Ayana V Jackson. I'm also reachable at Ayana V Jackson. I'll put that in the chat. But I would like to once again thank Solange and the Photo London team for this very, very generous invitation. And unfortunately, I will not be able to see these beautiful works on view, but I encourage all of you to please spread the word. And we hope to see each of you soon. And Senzeni, once again, congratulations for your presentation with the for your presentation at as Photo London, and also your recent award. You're a recipient of a prize recently, is it not right?
Yes, it was 2023, the K21 Global Art Award. I was the first recipient of the new award. Next week, the second winner of 2024 is coming next week. But to my relief, because I don't have to be the only person that's award. I look forward to the announcement next week, Monday, um, and to kind of see the award grow. Um, yes.
Wonderful.
Thank you, Ayana, and people from Photo London and Helen Rogers from Koop and our audience for allowing us this hour to speak about photography and my work in South Africa. I hope that many of you will be able to go through to Photo London. I'll try and keep in touch with it as much as I possibly can and be
Wonderful.
available online to answer questions. So thank you, Ayana, for
Thank
your
you.
time.
Of course. Love you dearly. And so it was an honor to do this. All right. So with that, I think we thank everyone for who arrived, and we will see each other again.
Yes, thank you.